Hi, let's say that you're working on a virtual assistant that is working for, let's say, the Dutch market. Then there is an interesting challenge afoot, and that is that not every user is going to be the same. And in particular, you might have some users who will be speaking to you in Dutch, and I think it's safe to say that this will be the largest group, but you might also have a couple of users who are talking in English. So a very natural question arises, which is, how might you be able to deal with this? The virtual assistant, after all, will have a natural language understanding pipeline of sorts, and it could get quite tricky to have two languages passed through it. That is why some people have suggested to me that it might be an interesting idea to explore putting a translation step in here. If we ever detect that English is going in, then we can translate that to Dutch before passing that on to our natural language pipeline. And I get where this idea comes from. However, there are definitely some downsides in translation technology that we should keep in the back of our minds. And what I would like to do in this video is just explore some of the tricky things you might come across if you are going to be translating virtual assistant text for your pipeline. So I'm going to start with a translation tool that's hosted on Hugging Face. I'm going to try out the Opus MT English to Dutch model that's made by the Helsinki NLP group. And I'm just going to go and try out a bunch of things in the widget here. So let's say I say something like, howdy, with 3 exclamation points. And here's the result. Now, I agree that howdy and then 3 exclamation points is a bit of a odd way to say hello, but we can see that it didn't necessarily translate it. And that's probably because this is a fairly uncommon way to say hello, or if nothing else, it's perhaps likely that whatever this model was trained on doesn't include utterances like this one. Another thing to just be slightly mindful of is the computation time. This took almost 1/4 of a second to translate. Part of that is because we're using neural networks that do require a fair bit of compute, but you could wonder if you're willing to have each and every utterance be delayed by 1/4 of a second. If you're not careful, this is going to affect the user experience quite a bit. However, if I were to just simply type hello there, then we do see that it's able to translate it correctly and that it's even able to add punctuation and a little bit of spelling correction. Let's now give it a proper sentence though, just to see what would happen. Something like, I would also like to pay my Visa bill. Which arguably could be a thing you could expect in a financial situation inside of a virtual assistant. Now again, we incurred a compute time, but there's something more interesting happening with this translation here that deserves attention. You see, in English, it's kind of common to say Visa bill, and in this case, Visa would refer to a credit card, not necessarily to a visa which you need to enter and leave a country. But if I read this in Dutch, ik wil graag mijn visumrekening betalen, then this literally translated means bill for a international visa. And although it's a subtle change, I do hope that you can appreciate that there's an opportunity here for things to go just slightly awry. In the context of a virtual assistant that's dealing with financial information, visa here would definitely refer to the credit card, not to an international traveling document. So let's now consider maybe a different translation engine, one that's not based on a Hugging Face model, and let's instead go for the well-known Google Translation tool. I am now using Google Translate, as you can see over here, and my goal is to just explore how this service might deal with a couple of these interesting examples in translation. The first thing that we can see is that, of course, my Visa bill, like before, is translated into visumrekening. So even though Google Translate is an impressive product, we shouldn't assume that it's going to cause a perfect translation. One thing we should keep in the back of our minds if we are going to use a service like Google is that our virtual assistant, if we want to receive translations, needs to send data to a cloud service before we get a translation back. In certain situations, this could be fine, But if the text that is being sent to and from the cloud service is relatively private, then we will need to think twice before we actually use such a service in our assistant. Having said this, let's now play around some more. Let's see what would happen if I would type howdy in here. This is a little bit awkward. Again, I want to fully acknowledge that howdy is not necessarily a common way to say hello, but it's translated into hoezo. And hoezo means why in most cases in Dutch. Let's try another one. Let's try yo. This also doesn't get translated quite well. And the reason is that yo now gets translated into ja, and this means yes in Dutch. Now, we could ask ourselves the question what might be happening here, but one thing that is good to keep in the back of our minds is that I am now playing around with really short sentences. The translation engine doesn't get a whole lot of opportunity to maybe learn from context in the sentence to come to a good translation. I am really just giving it 2 characters. And here, again, yo might be more slang English than what you might find in a lot of books or common training material, so it's not that big of a surprise that it's just having a lot of difficulty in this translation. However, if I really were to point out what the most common weakness is in these translation engines, I'm going to have to try to translate it the other way around. So now what I'm going to try and do is translate from Dutch to English. And here's where I can point to a more painful cultural phenomenon. You see, there's a lot of different ways in Dutch to say goodbye. You could say doei. And you could certainly argue that in Dutch, this is the most common way of saying goodbye. If you were watching TV, for example, odds are that you're going to see this. However, I'm from the southern region of the Netherlands, from a place called Brabant. And here it's kind of normal to say houdoe as you're saying goodbye. But saying this is relatively uncommon unless you are from the southern province of the Netherlands. If you were from the south of the Netherlands, this would be a very common way to say goodbye. But in this case, even Google's translation engine is having a little bit of trouble detecting it. In fact, it seems to think it might be Chinese, and you can see that it almost gets it right in the translation. And also here, I'm doing a little bit of a naughty trick because technically I could also just say howdo, which you could say is more common. But if someone were to type howdoe, then basically they are just saying bye, not bye and then followed by hey. I do think, however, that it's going to be incredibly confusing for a NLU pipeline if goodbye gets translated into bye and hey. That is bound to cause problems when we're trying to understand the user. Now, the reason why I want to zoom in on this is because I think it's fair to say that, sure, Dutch is a language, but there are many dialects. And typically, this is where translation engines get a whole lot of things wrong. They might be able to detect common patterns in the general Dutch language, but the moment that you go specific on a dialect, things just get a little bit awkward. For example, let's suppose that the user is from Belgium. There's a dialect called Flemish, which also has a couple of words that they don't have in the Netherlands. A very common one is the word bompa. Now, bompa in Flemish means grandfather, but it's translated into what I would argue isn't even an English word. And again, I cannot blame it, because this word is really uncommon unless you are from the Flemish region. But the more you start thinking about Flemish, the more awkward it gets. For example, in Flemish, if someone were to say kleedje, then it means dress. But if you're not Flemish and you're from the Netherlands, then kleedje would mean rug. And you might think, well, this will just be a couple of words where you have this interesting phenomenon. But if I were to type Holland, then you could wonder what it means. If a Belgian person were to refer to Holland, then they are typically referring to the Netherlands, which is a country. However, if a Dutch person were to refer to Holland, then they are typically referring to a region in the Netherlands. And here you can imagine that there are just so many cultural aspects, especially if they are related to dialects, that we are going to need to be very careful in assuming that a translation engine is going to be able to properly capture what the user means. And in this case, I am translating between Dutch and English, but you can imagine very similar problems when you think about Irish English, UK English, the English in the United States and Australia. Sure, you could argue that if we are making virtual assistants in all of these regions, that we are going to need an assistant that speaks English, but we should also be aware that English means different things depending on where you are, because there are many different cultural aspects, especially if they are related to dialects. And the same thing you could argue for perhaps Canadian French and the French that they speak in France. And to give a final example of this, let's try Bill needs to pay the bill. You see, the token bill could refer to a name of a person. It could also refer to a bill that needs to get paid, but it can also refer to a piece of legislation. And the way it gets translated is rekening moet de rekening betalen. And rekening here means bill that needs to get paid. We might be able to improve things slightly if we have a capital letter here, because now bill with a capital letter is actually detected as a name. But if we are working with virtual assistants, we cannot assume proper spelling. And I hope here you also recognize that, especially if we're dealing with names, and especially if we're dealing with entity detection tasks, translation really does pose a risk.